Technology, diversity, wine, the redwoods, and everything in between. Welcome to the Northern California Bay Area, and one show takes you inside the real estate that makes it all happen. This is By the Bay.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to By the Bay. I am your host, Dan Ancheta, and I appreciate you being here. It's been a little while since I've recorded a podcast. You get like that pod fade thing where you do a bunch and then you get busy with life and other things, but I'm back. It's the beginning of July. It's the second half of the year, and I'm really grateful that you're here. So please do like and subscribe anywhere that you're watching or listening to this. We have a returning guest today. Ryan O'Connell is back here from How to ADU. And you just got back from like quite an adventure on the East Coast. And so before we get into that story, remind us who you are, what you do, and how we got to be here.
That's it. So I'm based in Napa, which isn't so far from Dan's office in the HQ.
Yep.
And I'm all about housing in the Bay Area and California in general. I have a YouTube channel, TikTok, and all that jazz about accessory dwelling units.
Okay.
Just helping homeowners build homes in their backyards, convert part of their house into an apartment. And that's allowed me to do a lot of housing advocacy stuff, which is very near and dear to me.
Right. So we had talked in our previous episode, like the basics of what is an accessory dwelling. It's a granny unit. It's a granny flat. It's this and that. And there's all sorts of different intricate kind of details depending on the jurisdiction that you're in about what it is and what's allowed and so on. Can you give us the overview, maybe like at the state level? Because that's probably like the biggest changes, right? Like what is actually allowed? What is permitted by law when it comes to accessory dwelling units?
That's the cool thing is California as a state said, okay, now every jurisdiction is going to allow for these accessory dwelling units. If you've got a primary home, now you can have an accessory home. And broadly speaking, if your city doesn't have any rules, then it can be up to 1,200 square feet, and it can be up to this height and all these details. And then if your city wants to adopt rules, they can, but they can be no more limiting than X. And so what I say is it's really safe to assume you can build an ADU under 800 square feet, and that's a new detached kind of structure, or you can convert part of your existing home, any size, into an ADU.
So what are the common, so like you look at this a lot, right?
Yeah.
So when I think of an ADU, I think of like a small studio above a detached 2-car garage. Sure. And I'm not sure if that's really typical, or is it like cutting off part of the house and converting it? Like what is the most common place you see these?
The common, like the mode ADU depends a little bit on jurisdiction. So like in a place like Los Angeles, you're going to have tons of garage conversions.
Sure.
But in a place like Sonoma County, where there is a little bit more lot space available in a lot of even the urban environments, then you're going to have detached units, and they tend to be under 800 square feet for a variety of reasons. So yeah, that's kind of the typical is like a small detached unit or a conversion of an existing non-living space are the two most common in my experience. But it's a super flexible tool. So I'm really worried about putting that information out there without putting an asterisk next to it and saying like, you could do so many things. The above the garage is perfectly feasible, especially if you have a newer built garage with a real foundation, or if you have the money to go in and do footings and stuff. Then there's a lot, there's just, the sky's the limit.
Right.
And now the state is even getting more, the state is looking at different ways to interpret the rules and saying, hey, actually this says you could do both. You could do a detached unit and a conversion. And so people are starting to understand you can do a lot.
So like if I had a property that had a garage, right, I can convert that into an accessory dwelling unit. And let's say I also, just the way that my house was laid out, like a ranch style house, it's kind of like single story and like sprawling. I could like cut off a portion of it, make it its own standalone unit as a junior accessory dwelling unit, and have like 3 independent living residences on the same property.
Yeah, you don't even need to use junior. If you did the second one as a detached structure, then you could do 2.
I need a flow chart, man. This is it's super complex.
It's really, well, this is, and it's great job security for the YouTuber, but like the rules keep kind of evolving. And I've seen lots now where they do 2 ADUs, no junior, so there's no deed restriction that requires owner occupancy, which is very typical for the junior units.
Okay.
Without getting too far down that rabbit hole. I've seen places where they hit a wall and they're like, Ryan, it looks like I can't do the second part. I'm like, oh, just use SB9. It's a different law. And they're like, okay, what's the difference? There is the utilities will be a little bit separate, but that's the only difference. And so there's always these ways to look at the tools in your tool belt that the state has created and say, hey, there's a lot of ways to build more housing. If your goal is to build housing, and it's to use an existing lot, an existing infrastructure, there are a lot of tools you have now.
Right.
So it's important not to get too bogged down. And when I say the most common ones, like big asterisk,
Right.
don't think that that's your only option.
But there's a ton of ways to do it. So I guess I want to take a step back and go like, why should people care about this?
Yeah,
and like, what is the solution? Like, what is the problem? What is the solution? I guess is like the high level question.
Yeah. So philosophically, like I really think we need more housing. I think we don't have enough homes for the people who want to live here and work here. And I don't think we should get there with like handouts or anything revolutionary. I think we just need to give homeowners the right to build housing again, like we had for the majority of American history up until we started saying, no, it's illegal to build a house in your backyard.
Right.
So that's kind of the grand philosophy.
Right.
But then what I almost never talk about that.
Right.
I almost always tell homeowners, look, you got a house. What do you want to do with your property? And homeowners have a lot of different places they come from, but they're broadly, they want to create more security for themselves or a family member, right? And if it's, I want to retire and downsize, but I don't want to leave my neighborhood, great, build a little ADU for yourself in the back. It's your forever home, and then you rent out the front house. Maybe it's, I want my kids are graduating college and they can't afford to come back to the Bay Area. And I was like, then let's build a place for them. They can still pay you rent, but like, there's a lot of multifamily, multi-generational mixes that end up working. And then there's everything under the sun. You see senior care, where somebody puts a caretaker on their property.
The granny unit, the place where you put granny, right?
Yeah, exactly. You see, one of my favorites is the world traveler. You're at a stage in life where you want to spend a lot of your life traveling around the world, doing cruises and stuff. You don't need a giant 3-story house.
Sure. You need a home base. You need a place to go and kind of park.
Put the ski stuff in the summer and put the beach stuff in the winter.
Right.
And so you build a little ADU for that, a little pied-à-terre, and then you get to do the whole shebang. And your main house is rented out and affords you this incredible retirement lifestyle. So you see everything. And I think that's why it should matter to people. On top of that, just boring, nerdy stuff since the last time we talked.
Sure.
Man, this is 1 in 5 new homes in California now.
Has an
ADUs.
Has an ADU.
Are
is an
ADUs. So like 20% of the housing production in California, which is the biggest state, is accessory dwelling unit. So
really, that's surprising to me. That's crazy.
Nuts. And so 5 years ago, when we were working on ADU rules, it wasn't me, when awesome people were working on these ADU rules, people said, yeah, but it'll never make a big difference. Like, it's one of the reasons we got so many cool laws passed. People were like, ADUs.
It's a passing fad.
Yeah.
Like the internet.
It's a pool house.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, pool house.
Yeah, rich people use it to build pool houses. Zoom forward.
Yeah.
And like, we're building a ton of new housing that's incremental.
Right.
Thanks to these tiny houses.
And I've also seen builders doing this as part of their like new construction plan, is to go like, hey, is our house $900,000 for a starter house? Yes, but there's a 600 square foot ADU that you can rent out, and here's the market rent. So net, if you rent it out fair market value, your mortgage payment is actually X, and it's more affordable than, and I think as a sales tactic and actually like helping with housing affordability, that's huge if you have an income generating portion of your home.
Yeah, that's it. And we can quibble about specific examples because I've seen beautiful ones and bad ones.
Sure.
But like ultimately the lesson here is if you give property owners more freedom about what they can do with their property, they will come up with good ideas.
But what if it's in a historic downtown and it's not built to the character of, I'm being facetious.
I know. But like, and I see it all, right? And I'm actually I'm an architecture nerd. I love historic buildings. And so I totally get that. What I try to tell people, even when we're like vibing over architectural significance,
sure,
I'm like, you see all the campers that are parked on that street now, right? Like that's people living in their cars. You're not solving your preservation dream right now. You're just forcing it into weirder places.
Right.
And so like if you really want to protect the character of a neighborhood, be it historic or otherwise, don't you think your kids should be able to move into that neighborhood? Like, because eventually it'll just get old and age out.
Right.
If
it's a really good point. I think, lots of jurisdictions are dealing with high density, transit oriented housing, and that's been the solution, right? Build a bunch of housing near public transportation. And that makes a lot of sense, but that doesn't work for every community, right? That just doesn't work for every community and every lifestyle. But if you have underutilized land or underutilized property that you can repurpose, doesn't that also create high density housing?
That's it.
Like that's not crazy to think about it.
That's it. It's density, whether it's high density or just a little denser.
A smidge more dense.
Right. This is actually a great segue for the DC stuff that I just did.
Yes.
Because
you're based here in California. So we're sitting in Petaluma in my office, and you're based in Napa, 2 valleys away.
I'm
right?
so happy to be back in Sonoma right
back
now.
back in Sonoma County. So you're based in Napa, but you just did like a stint in DC.
Yeah, I did 6 months in Washington, DC.
So what brought you there, and tell me, like you went from kind of local, county, state-based housing stuff to like national housing conversations.
Yeah, that was the hope, is that like, let's see, we've got so much traction. We're winning so much at the state level in California, and I get to do so much good work here. Can I participate in that conversation at a national level and get this 1 in 5 new housing units rolling out in other places around the country, and or not?
Sure.
And I think so that's the answer to the question.
Okay. So what were the highlights? Okay, well, I guess the first question is this a problem/solution in every community, or is this like a California problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. California is kind of the showcase of what the problem will look like in 3 or 5 years everywhere.
Okay.
But it's already a big problem, even in relatively what people think of is like states without a housing cost problem. Actually, if you look at it, people earn a minimum wage, can't afford to rent an apartment for 30% of their income or less in almost any part of the country.
Okay.
And like that's if that were the end of it, I know a lot of people would say, well, that's politically that's fine, but it's all moving in the wrong direction, where that cost is creeping up, and that cost is eventually going to hit home ownership as well. And you see it in more. So this is a national problem, but it's different in every part of the country, and that's part of what's been interesting. So there's a role for ADUs nationwide, and lots of other states are adopting statewide laws or trying. Now that's been a fun part of the national conversation.
But California tends to lead the charge in like pretty much all things politics, right? So like they pilot EV vehicles, right, weren't going to be rolled out nationwide until California did mass adoption of it because there's such a huge market for it. And then everyone kind of followed along.
That's it,
right?
Yeah.
So the idea is taking policies that are working in California and implementing them in other states that make sense. And eventually Oklahoma gets it, right? But they don't necessarily have a housing issue like we have.
That's a great lens. It's partially, I also want to say, like, California didn't invent the ADU, right? And so we saw a lot of successful models that were set at a city level. I say we again. Some really smart reform people who like the Casita Coalition and some other groups that now I get to participate in. They looked at these models, and whether it was laneways in Vancouver in Canada, or whether it was ADUs in Portland or Granny Flats in Australia, they were like, there's something here. And the way to do it in California is at the state level, because we have so many mid or small jurisdictions in California that it actually make a huge difference. Whereas in Portland, they could just do Portland and Portland Metro. And actually that was the majority of the win for the state.
Majority of the housing stock in the state of Oregon is in Portland. It's such a massive metro area. The density, population density is really, really thin pretty much everywhere else.
Exactly.
Right.
Whereas if you did it just in LA and San Diego, and it would have had an impact, but you'd be missing out on the real win, which is all these suburban and slightly urban communities where you can do some infill.
Okay.
Infill's such an ugly word. Anyway, we
You know,
put in some
it's so
beautiful
funny.
little homes.
Like, so I think we talked about this before. It's like Petaluma has an urban growth boundary. So we like can't go out past a certain boundary, which I think is really cool. Like it's smart to preserve, the countryside. And I like the fact that when I drive out of Petaluma into another town, I'm driving through, farmland to get to the next city instead of it all being mooshed together into like, where am I exactly? I don't really know.
Part of the vibe.
Part of the vibe.
Like,
part of the thing that we do. That said, there still needs to be more housing built. So like infill, ugly word, I get that, but I like infill. Infill makes sense. Here's an underutilized lot that has not historical significance. Oh, of course, my phone rings. Oh my goodness.
Drink break.
That is such a podcasting 101 error there.
It's okay. This drink is not sponsored, so we'll cut the whole
That's
thing.
okay, right, exactly. This should sponsor. You're going to send them a letter. Anyway, what was I saying?
You want to preserve that buffer zone around
you
Petaluma.
do. Buffer zone is cool, but we still need more housing. So how do you solve that problem? You have to take underutilized land and repurpose it into large, high-density, multi-story residences that are affordable for like normal people.
That's it. You just whatever the conversation is. I do believe in governance, right? Like
Sure.
Local government. Yay! It's great to have rules that preserve agriculture or preserve a cool neighborhood. And there's a cost to that, and it's that you got to put the houses somewhere.
Right.
And so I just think every community needs to engage in that conversation. Because Californian jurisdictions on the whole have had a hard time doing both of those things at the same time, like paying for lunch and getting lunch.
Right.
The state has put in some rules that make it easier to just happen. And I won't speak for Petaluma specifically, but a lot of the time, the people who work at the planning department, they know that you need to put the houses somewhere. Right. And they're really frustrated because it's like, but anytime we propose a project, it gets rejected.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, these state rules lay down some cover so the local electeds can go like, oh, it's out of our hands.
Yep.
There's the state rules.
Well, there's state mandates, right? There's housing unit goals that we have to hit. Otherwise you like lose funding and stuff from the state, right? So they're basically saying we hold the purse strings. You're going to do what we ask you to do. Now, how you do that is kind of up to your local jurisdiction. And we won't get into builder remedy and all that other stuff because that's a fascinating topic that is a whole other thing. But, it makes sense that we need to build housing. We need to build housing at all different levels. You need the $5 million houses. You need the, accessory dwellings. You need all types of housing to meet the different needs of different people, right? Mm-hmm. So talk to me about your experience in Washington and like what were you working on? What is the conversation at the national level around this solution? And like, which way is the wind blowing in terms of a national adoption of it, or what is the trend?
Because I think this is, and I'll do that, and then I'll bring it back to the Bay. Because what's important when you're thinking about, it's called By the Bay, right? If people are thinking about real estate, this is a trend that's going to continue in this direction, especially in California. Like we're doing well, we're making wins, we're going to have more and more opportunities for homeowners to do more on their property.
Right.
And that means you can create a lot of value. And then nationally, we're going to see two things. This is a prediction, so I could be wrong, but come back at me if you want this.
In the comments, yes, exactly.
One is ADUs are very popular. They're on they're the tip of everybody's tongue. So every state legislator who wants to adopt a housing policy and campaign on it is talking about ADUs. And there's good ways to do it and bad ways, but the trend is more ADUs at the state level. And then there's a whole other raft of housing reform. I won't talk about builder's remedy because that'll take a whole hour.
Yes, exactly.
But there's a whole raft of other things we can do. And ADUs, like you said earlier, they're not perfect for every neighborhood, right? There's some places where ADUs are the best way to reach it. Some places where actually, if you've got a high transit center and you're a 20-minute transit commute from like Minneapolis, actually the most efficient thing there isn't to do a single family home with an ADU in the backyard. It's a big apartment building, right? 5-story. And so figuring out what works best in each environment and which reforms fit in. That's kind of what we've been talking about at that national level, and trying to find what you don't want is, well, sorry, what I don't want is the national federal government to say, here's a policy that we're going to apply to every single city in this country.
Right.
It's not a path for success. It's one size fits all. It's very slow and cumbersome, and like you're just going to break a lot of eggs, not make very many omelets.
Yeah, and probably wind up spending a lot of time in court fighting different jurisdictions and who has, authority and why do they get to make the rules when it's a state issue and it's a local issue. And interestingly, I think the mechanism aside, like it's important that we take a look at the policy and go like how it's implemented. Okay, fine. What is the trend? What is the consumer really needing and wanting here, right? Yeah. And what makes the most sense? Like that 5-story apartment building thing, I guess, tangent. If you want to, like you said earlier, if you want to preserve the character of your neighborhood and you don't want a 5-story, super efficiently built, complex built in, like build a bunch of ADUs. So you meet the housing requirement without having to do, does that make sense?
Like, if you can meet the need through, whatever housing.
Yes.
Like California especially has a structure in place where you can just do it. Like as a city, prove that you can create the housing, create it, and then you
get left alone.
Backs.
Right.
Yeah.
Get left alone.
Also, the developers aren't dumb. Like they don't go build apartments where there's tons of cheap single family homes you can rent.
Right.
They're looking at neighborhoods and saying like, ooh, this neighborhood is ripe for apartments. It's already, the vacancy rates are super low on the existing apartment rentals. There aren't a lot of seasonal rental availability. Like this is where I'm going to go. And so if you compete with those developers, it's hard to think that way. But like if you're building in your neighborhood, developers are going to look at the neighborhood where nothing's getting built.
Totally.
But yeah, so national trends, lots of things going on. And what the federal government is really good at is sitting in a position to do all the research once. So right now, every time a small town, there's 40,000 local government agencies that oversee zoning in this country. Yeah.
Super efficient.
Yeah, super efficient.
Yes.
So we're laboratories of democracy.
Oh, goodness.
But anytime one of them wants to reform, they have to figure everything out from scratch. They have to read all the books. They have to figure out their local zoning and how to repeal the rules and how to replace them with good rules. They have to invent all that. And, I love local government, but it's usually like one planner for a town with like 10,000 people, right? It's not, I think 80% of those 40,000 jurisdictions have fewer than 15,000 people, something like that. So it's not, it's a hard thing to ask every jurisdiction to reinvent the wheel.
Sure.
And then you've got the local opposition from NIMBYs who want to make it as hard as possible.
You had to hold that up because I don't think it's totally
sorry. It's my little mascot now, the NIMBY. The not in my backyarder.
Yes.
And so that the local opponents to reform or change, they're scared of any kind of change. And so every jurisdiction has to have that fight over and over. And the national government is in a great place to say, hey, we've got an agency that thinks about housing all the time. They have a policy development, policy research and development arm. Let's just ask them to do this research, create a library of all the reform you can do and how it works in different places.
So literally going to HUD and being like, hey, you're like housing and urban development, right?
That's it.
And so,
and here's the great news. That exists. That office wants to do this work. It just needs to know that like the work is going to be consumed and appreciated.
And you don't have to create a whole new bureaucracy and buy new desks and
that's it.
And new copy machines and like it all exists. You just have to utilize the existing resources and say, how do we create the research so that the little, 10,000 resident town can pull from a library and go, this makes sense. This policy makes sense for us. This one doesn't. We want to do this here, but not that. And this makes sense for our community.
And you have pictures of neighborhoods 5 years after the reform takes place. And like, this is what happened there. Oh, it looks the same. Or, oh, there's a townhouse.
Right.
Like, that's not so bad. On the other hand, transit-oriented design, you see, okay, whoa, that's a big building next to a muni station or whatever station. Okay, maybe that's not going to appeal in this particular geography. Anyway, there's just so much value to that library. And then you you have the staff on hand to say, if you're a small town and you want to adopt some of these rules, we'll do the one-time investment and hire some third parties to come in and help the locals
Sure.
to adopt the rules in their
Give you a
region.
case manager and help you make this easy.
Yeah. It's a super slam dunk policy.
So that is happening right now.
Well, I wish. The agency wants to do it.
That's not happening right now.
I'm advocating for it. Groups like Up for Growth at the national level, YIMBY Action at the state and local level we're all singing from the same songbook. And so I'll throw a link in the show notes or in the comments to go sign a petition if you want to help. And then in particular, if you happen to know a small jurisdiction like 25 to 50,000 residents that would want to sign up a support letter to HUD, we're trying to show HUD, like, look, here's a list of towns that would love this product. Because HUD is used to they spend a lot of money on rental subsidies on big apartment buildings in big cities. And so that's their normal customer. And I really think that there's a huge value, and I think HUD believes that there's a huge value in shifting that attention and focus to the majority of American towns. And so that's
No, it makes total sense.
That's the national thing.
Makes total sense. Okay.
All that to say, to bring it back to the Bay, there's a huge potential here. There's momentum toward homeowners being able to do more with their properties, and it's just the dominoes are falling all in the same direction. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
And
we hear this a lot from our consumers where they're like, I can't believe I actually have to get, like, it's my property. How come someone can tell me what to do with it? Well, it's because those are the zoning laws. And there's probably good reasons as to why those laws exist, but they do sometimes they overstretch. And like, you can't tell me I can't build another, as long as the land supports it and the septic and, all the utility. I mean, as long as it makes sense for the land, you're not like overusing it.
Yeah.
Right. To kind of,
there's
break that down for me.
Yeah,
like,
there's good reasons and there's bad reasons why those rules exist. And the good reasons are like, you don't want a pollutant being right next to your public school. Like,
sure.
Duh.
Right.
And so there are rules that we should all have for that. At the same time, the same ability, the same sort of jurisdictional, the police power that we gave local governments to do that, we gave them the ability to say, like, and we also don't want this group of people, whether it's because of the color of their skin or how much money they make, we don't want them to live on this street. And it's like, well, you guys, different. And so that's two extremes. And then there's a lot of examples that are less controversial in the middle, and or rather they're less obvious in the middle. And you just have to go through these rules one at a time. And to be honest, even though those two examples get the most press, the majority of the examples are broadly dumb.
Okay.
So the easiest thing in the world is like every city basically has free parking minimums that are required when you develop something.
Right.
So if you want to put in a commercial strip mall and you want one of the buildings to be a restaurant, one of the buildings to be a department
certain number
store,
of parking spots per 1,000 square feet of rental space.
that's it. And it depends on the use and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And all those numbers are completely made up. Like the history of
Wait, the 4 per 1,000 doesn't have a scientific reason?
the best, there's a great book called The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. And
Okay.
if you read that, it will really drive home the point that like all this was made up in the 50s and 60s based on like people studying, and like even when there is a reason, it's like, oh, well, we studied the peak shopping hour of the peak day of the year, and we're like, well, we should always have enough parking for peak retail shopping on the day before Christmas. And you're like, and that spread.
And so every single parking lot does that now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like you see it, this should resonate with personal experience when you drive to a mall, or if you still do that. There's a lot of open parking spots, but you like circle because you want the one that's like close
Totally.
to the door.
100%.
But you pass tons of empty parking at most of these retail. And then we have the same rules for residential development, where like if I want to build a studio in most parts of California, I need to provide 1.5 parking spaces. The 1.5 parking spaces, given the logistics of how big cars are in California, is bigger than the studio. I am required to devote more land to the
To parking
cars
a car
than to
than
the humans.
a place to live.
And that's all arbitrary. And so like if you give developers the ability to build less parking, they'll still want to build parking because it's valuable.
Right.
to
It's an
the
amenity to
tenants.
the tenants
Yeah.
and to the homeowners, right?
And they'll come up with clever ways to make sure it's reserved for the tenant. They're
Sure.
they will figure this out because money is on the line. But if you just tell them that they have to build parking, you're just you're subsidizing free parking, and you're driving the cost of housing up, or the cost of retail, or the cost.
You know,
of
it's so funny because if you now, I was just thinking, driving around, look, the office complex that we're in, it's mostly empty parking lot.
Yeah.
Right. There's like way too many parking spots and not enough. I mean, other uses. I mean, even if you just left it as like a park or whatever, you know what I mean? Like it's pretty crazy.
And land is valuable.
Land is valuable, right? So we're just covering it up with asphalt and saying, well, potentially, hypothetically, on the craziest, busiest day, and all of these, hypotheticals align, we might need this much parking.
It's wild. Okay, I'll give you a counter example.
Okay.
Just because I've been ranting.
Sure.
I love ranting about free parking, blah, blah, blah. But actually, we in this state, we drive a lot. Your car is parked at your house in the evening. It's parked at your work in the day, if you still work on a location. So like there's a reason we got to where we got, and like the solution isn't reverse like ban. Yeah, I don't even want to say it. And so when we talk at the national level, free parking is actually like parking requirements, parking mandates are actually one of the things that come up as a good example of a policy that won't work everywhere. Because if you live in a rural community where you're 25-minute drive from the hospital, 20-minute drive from the grocery store, obviously, even if we went through the fight of removing the parking mandate, you'd still need to build parking.
Sure.
On every residential development. And so you'd put in all this political fight. You'd get flack from the local NIMBYs, but then would you get much benefit? Probably not.
Right.
So you want that library of resources to say, these are the communities where honestly your parking mandates are shooting yourself in the foot. And these are the communities where like, no, that's probably not the first top 10 fights you want to pick.
Right.
Like go focus on ADUs and granny flats, go focus on townhomes, things like that.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I hear that. I hear that kind of like counterpoint to like, oh, well, you have these existing neighborhoods and you start adding all these other like residences. Where are we ever going to park? It's like, well, we'll figure that out. You might have to walk like 100 feet or whatever. It might not be right in your own front yard, but like you'll find a place to park. It'll be fine.
And importantly, it's that local government conversation again. Yes, we need to think about where cars park.
Sure.
The way you do that is by having a conversation about car parking and car ownership, not by banning houses.
Right.
If I went out,
I'm going to ban houses because I don't want so many cars.
That's it. If I was walking the dog and there's like dog poop everywhere, I wouldn't be like, we should ban dogs or ban houses because dogs live in houses. Like I would be like, we should really make people clean up after them.
Have a conversation about why it's important that we clean up after our animals.
That's it. We should have fines if you leave and mess in the street.
Maybe have some resources and have some boxes with bags out on heavily trafficked areas and make it easy for people to comply.
That's it. And instead with cars, very typically, I talk about ADUs and people say like, the parking on my street is already a mess. And I get that that's super frustrating, but like banning houses has not prevented all those cars.
Right. It's still a problem
because people can have as many cars as they want.
Right.
There's no street parking permits, and so there's no cost to a family having multiple cars. And so if you want to improve parking, like you deal with the parking, and people don't love the idea of paying for a parking permit. But if you couple it with but the benefit, regardless of the housing, so, put the housing aside.
Sure.
You said your street is overcrowded right now. There's too much parking on your street. The solution is parking permits on your street. And wouldn't you love, if whatever the fee is for that parking permit annually, it means that you only have one car parked in front of your house. And most nights, guess what? It'll be yours. If that's worth that to you, then let's engage in this policy. Don't try to do it by banning houses because you're already in that world.
You're already in that. The problem isn't being solved with the current policy. Okay, so go back to the Washington stuff. Right, because I've been following your journey and watching the channel and stuff. But what were the major highlight conversations that maybe were being had out there? Give us again, which way is the wind blowing type of thing, and kind of frame that up for us in terms of what's the on the cutting edge. You're on the cutting edge of these conversations, right? You're at the highest level of these. So what can we expect happening in the future?
Well, sometimes the best changes are like the wonkiest, weirdest details.
Okay.
Like I'll shoot, because I'm YouTube, right? I'm shooting video. And then when I'm editing a week later, I'm like, wait a second. If this and this are both true. And so here's two things that are really crazy and in the weeds. The Freddie Mac is proposed a second position mortgage, and it's been approved by the FHFA. And so that second position mortgage is going to allow homeowners to access a lot of capital that's locked into their house without changing that current rate.
So let's frame that up, because it's important so people understand.
Yeah.
So Freddie Mac is a government sponsored enterprise, right? GSE. And essentially they enact the policies of the FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Authority. I should know all these acronyms. We love acronyms in real estate.
Love a good TLA.
Exactly. Yes. So essentially what that does is policy is passed by legislators, right? And they basically have given permission to Freddie Mac to allow securitization of second deed of trust, of second lien position, 30-year fixed mortgages. What that means is that if you have an existing first mortgage at 2.5%, like the one I was looking at this morning, you don't want to refinance that to access some of the equity. In this particular case, this guy this morning owns a house probably worth $1 million, owes $200,000 at 2.5%, would like to take out some money to do something with it. Wasn't built an ADU, but let's just make believe that it was. Mm-hmm. And let's say he needs $300,000. The cost overall of refinancing all of the debt, getting rid of the $200,000, the $200,000 at 2.5%, doesn't make sense necessarily to refinance all the debt. But if you could access some of the equity and not have it in a variable rate like home equity line of credit that might have like a 10% interest rate on it that's variable, we might be able to encourage people to borrow, which it spurs economic activity, right? And creates more economic activity and therefore more wealth, right? More cycling of dollars. Pulling equity out and allowing Freddie Mac to do these second deed of trust and then selling them as a mortgage-backed security, which basically means it's cheaper financing, 30-year fixed, cheaper financing. Yeah. So you won't necessarily, like let's say the average interest rate right now is 7% on a first. Maybe it's 8% on a second, but it's not 12.
That's it.
Right? So it makes it more affordable for people to access the equity in their current homes without having to refinance their first.
Correct. Okay. And then you can even imagine financing your ADU through whatever means.
Sure.
Friends and family, hard money, whatever. But then once you're done, it's much easier to do a new assessment of the new values.
Sure. So if you have the equity currently, then you don't need to do like the as-built projection, right? Where you have to maybe borrow otherwise to build, which then increases the value, and then you refi. What we see a lot in California, especially where we're doing the majority of our business, is that people have got a ton of equity already in their house. So they don't actually need to do the as-built scenario where they already have $500,000 of lendable equity in it. It's just a matter of how do you get to it without it being super expensive and not touching my first that I've got at 2.5%. So
that's a new product.
Okay. That's a new product.
It's been approved. Unfortunately, the max loan amount is going to be like $78,000 on the pilot. And there's like a few $1 billion cap on the whole thing.
And by the way, highly, highly controversial in the mortgage world.
Duly noted.
There's people who are like, this is the worst thing ever. This is going to just destroy the whole world. And there's other people who are like, well, it's an opportunity and it could work just fine.
It'll generate several thousand loans.
Right. Yes.
But so this is a great example of what I was doing though. Like if you look at that public comment period, the agency received 400 and some messages. Virtually all of them, except my people, were negative. And but a staunch group of homeowners wrote in and said, I would be able to build more housing if I could access the equity in my house without refinancing. And I think we made a difference. I think by having real homeowners, because most of the naysayers were within the industry, right? with having real homeowners say, I would use this loan to build housing, that gave some cover to create this pilot.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure what like the Mortgage Bankers Association stance on it is.
No comment.
I honestly haven't read it because I try not to be swayed by what, it honestly makes, I mean, that mechanism already exists, right? You can go down to any local bank or credit union, and we even offer solutions through our broker network of like, we don't do those in-house. Those are mostly all brokered out. But that exists all over the place already.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of making it more affordable instead of it having to wind up on the balance sheet of some bank somewhere. And then, then you have a pretty wide range of rates.
And honestly, having in my view, a more regulated version of that product out, because people are trying to fit the Fannie and Freddie, well, Freddie for now, fit the Freddie requirements. So they'll be a little bit more conservative than they might if they were just doing it with portfolio. And anyway, so that's a good example. Very wonky. I figured it would speak to you, and like that little thing, I'm like, oh, it's going to make a big difference. Another one is manufactured housing, what we used to think of as mobile homes. They have just updated the HUD code, or it's supposed to come out this month. And the overall whispers are that it will include the first ever HUD code duplex. So a single section manufactured house that has 2 units in it, both with their own kitchen and both with their own bathroom, their own entrances. And what that actually does to the cost per unit is really, really remarkable. And so you'll be seeing people buying properties and putting in a primary with an ADU already attached at kind of record-breakingly low cost related to manufactured housing, and skipping a lot of the local permitting too. And those kinds of changes, you go like, whoa, that's this. It's just one product. It's some big portfolio at a big manufacturer and like the dealers won't know what to do with it but I'm looking at it, I'm like, I know exactly where this is going to end up. It's a beeline once that product's available and legal.
Yeah, that's. I mean, again, like I said earlier, so many of my buyers right now are looking at that like house hacking idea, right? Where like, how do I live in one unit and rent out the other? Got a contract yesterday for a client who already lives in the ADU. Actually, we're debating. So this is another like thing that we need to clarify in our industry. Is it a duplex?
Yeah.
Is it a single family with an ADU?
Sure.
That question comes up on pretty much every file, and depending on how it's classified and because it could be zoned for a duplex and only one unit is there, and that unit happens to have an ADU, or is it a duplex? I don't know.
Yeah, and in lending, the definitions matter a ton.
It matters a ton. Yeah. So the point, but that was a tangent. The point of this is that this borrower is living in the accessory dwelling, single guy, and is going to rent out the house with the future idea of moving into the house if and when decides to have a family and kind of evolves into needing the 3,000 square feet instead of the 1,200 square feet. So buying the whole thing qualifies for the whole thing, living in the smaller one, renting out the big one. It's really smart because he doesn't need the big house now, but he can acquire the property, become a homeowner, have all the benefits of that, and then, and then have the ability. And I was thinking about it, like he might flex, move into the big house, raise a family, do the thing, and then when they're all out, move back. And and doesn't have to relocate. He can live all in the same property for all different phases of life.
And at any point, you get an opportunity in another region or whatever, you've added a bunch of value to the property.
Right.
You're fine. Also, have you seen what just happened in San Jose? Condoization. We can condoize and sell ADUs separately now.
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, that's a really, so again, not to get, we had to do a whole episode on the condoization process, but essentially.
You want me to try the 10-second?
Give us the breakdown. So like people don't understand the difference in general. And realtors especially don't understand the difference between a PUD, a condo, a single family, anything. So
the 10-second version won't teach you that. But
yes,
in states like Texas, you can condoize anything. You can, so as long as you put through the condo map and have a little contractual agreement that like kind of forms a miniature HOA, then you can turn anything into a condo, right?
So basically, you're not splitting the lot into multiple separate parcels. It remains one parcel.
Correct.
But you are giving the exclusive right to use a certain portion of the commonly owned property to an individual.
Without getting too bogged down in the details, because there's actually a bunch of ways to map it.
Okay.
And like, I don't know, but there's lawyers who've been doing
Sure.
this in states like Texas, in places like Seattle. And so there's a bunch of different models. They're not as scary as you think.
Okay.
Is what I would say after having reviewed a bunch of them. You don't have to actually have like a little HOA war that like it doesn't. I've seen some really slick ways people put these together, but it's all a bunch of paperwork. And all it means is, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's given homeowners the right to do what they want with their property again. And so if you own a piece of land and you got a house and you build a little house in the backyard, you can go through a legal process to sell the use of that house in the backyard as if it were a condominium. And that's just the easiest way to think of it, because we all kind of see what condos are.
Sure.
And like, do get bogged down in the detail if you're going to go down this route.
Sure.
But don't freak out about it prematurely.
Right.
Like, these happen. They're very interesting. And right now, the state of California has said, if a city wants to allow it, they may allow it. And we're seeing cities start to allow it.
Yeah, they're doing this, like you said, Seattle, I think Portland are doing that. There's a slightly different model in other parts of the country. I think in Tennessee, there's a really interesting like row housing type of thing they do. And then in Massachusetts, there's another. So interesting how, like you said earlier, these ideas start in certain communities, and it makes sense for that community, right? Just like the density in Portland. I was just up in Portland a couple weeks ago, and like lots of density, lots of different types of housing, a lot of converted, houses into multiple dwelling. It's a really interesting mix, and it's all kind of smooshed together in a way that kind of makes sense, right? Right. But the ability to convey that property and sell it can be down to a very granular, like individual unit within a building without a ton of, like, the condo process used to take a long time to convert an existing existing structure into a condo. So then like places like San Francisco were doing things like TIC, tenancy in common, where it was kind of like a condo, but it wasn't. It was kind of skirting the rules of the condo. It's really odd.
You have co-op models.
You have co-op models, all sorts of different things. This basically is trying to make a policy. It's like, if you want to do this, you can. Here's the standard way to do it. Here's the type of paperwork. Again, pick from the menu. These are the things that you need to do, and then make it work.
And like a lot of things, it starts off with the state saying you can do this, and in a few years, the state will say, maybe you have to do this,
right?
And then in a few years after that, it'll say this is how you have to do it. And if at any point cities comply, then the state doesn't have to go through the next step.
Sure.
But if cities still have a hard time meeting their goals, then I would expect the trend. Or another option is we kind of see a couple cities adopt condoization and it doesn't work as well as we wanted it to, and we go, okay, well, let's not force everybody to.
Turns out that was not a great plan. Yeah, that's okay. We can pivot.
And so that's kind of where where I see things mapping out. Actually, I'll plug the ADU Academy. It happens multiple times a year, different cities each time. It's about to be in Seattle, which has a very developed condoization market, and that's on the tip of everybody's tongue in California. So that a lot of the academy will be devoted to the condo model, its pros and cons. We've got a lot of healthy conversation in the community about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and if people are professionals who are interested in that, it's definitely worth a trip up to Seattle. There'll be a tour where you get to see some of them in real life, and you get instructors who teach you about all these ADU basics.
So I think that's really cool, and we'll put
Sure.
some notes in the show notes so people can access that and get involved. So I guess when you're advocating for accessory dwellings and just basically housing solutions, I mean, I don't want to put you in one little area. Like, you're really looking at solutions for a national problem, right? Houses are very expensive.
Yeah.
The cost of living is very expensive. And if we can create different tiers of housing that makes it accessible, then people who live and work in our communities, can actually afford to live here and not have to be, commuting into our higher cost of living areas. We see it all the time, especially in where we are. If you can make like one request from the public to like, hey, here's what people really need to know or to do. Like, what do you think is the most impactful thing that people who care about their communities and want there to be housing solutions for people in all different parts of the spectrum? What's the most impactful thing that people could be doing right now?
This sounds lame.
It's okay.
Write an email to your city council members and just say like, hey, I'm like a normal person, so I don't come to the council meeting.
Perfect. How many council meetings have you been through? I've been through my fair share, and I've got to tell you, it's a special, unique kind of torture.
That's it. And like no normal hardworking person is going to then spend their few precious hours of downtime, or sometimes it's in the middle of the day that they schedule these things.
Yeah.
You're not going to skip work to go to a city council. So just write to them and say like, hey, I'm normal, so I don't get to come to a lot of these meetings.
Yes.
But I just want you to know, if you support more housing of different types, different styles in our community, I got your back. I will vote based on that. And I don't get to come out every time a project comes up, but I really wish that we had more housing. I wish, and make it personal, make it like my kids can't move back into town, or I'm worried about where I'm going to move if I need to downsize, and just tell them your story. And the more normal people they hear from, politicians like respond to that stuff, even local electeds. And like if the only people they ever see are in the grocery store yelling at them about a new apartment or a new development project, that's what they think of. And if they can just have one reasonable voice in the back of their head and they're like, you know what?
There's a normal person out there.
Yeah. She wrote to me. She said that she doesn't always have time to come out, but she cares, and it's her kids and it's her and it's her, that matters so much more than you know.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is a grassroots approach.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, anyone who is brave / and I know a lot of them personally, stupid enough to be elected people in like a local like city council. That's the most insane thing I think people do. I have no idea why they do it, but they do, and I'm grateful for them. So shout out to all you electeds out there. But it's great. I have no idea why you would want to do it, but people do. So write a letter to your representative, because like in Petaluma now we have districts, right? So write a letter to your district person and say, hey, I voted for you. I'm going to continue to vote for you because I want you to do these types of things, or be involved in, especially the election season coming up, right? So like get involved and ask the question of the electeds and write letters to them in support of more housing.
And like that makes a big difference. If you want help with that, YIMBY Action is an organization that like trains people up. It's yes in my backyard. So YIMBY. YIMBY Action. And like I run the Nepsalano chapter, or I help run it. And then like there's a chapter in every part of California, and like you can kind of learn how to get even more involved. But honestly, the first thing, write an email to your council member. You are making a bigger difference than you realize.
Okay, cool. I like it. Let's see. What else should we know about? I mean, there's so much. It's such a deep topic. We can go on for hours and hours.
That's it. I think it's an evolving space.
Okay.
If you're a professional, listen to this, and you're like, oh wow, that's too complicated. I can't possibly learn all this. The best thing to do is to just know who to point people to, right? And that's why all my resources, the YouTube channel, are free. There's videos that talk about the hundreds of millions of dollars in grant money that went to ADUs over the past couple of years. The channel, they got information about that faster than everybody else. And so they'll remember that you sent them to the right resources, right?
Yes.
Find designers or builders who care a lot about these smaller units. Because it's, if a contractor does big 2,500 square foot houses, they might not be interested in doing little ADUs.
Sure.
And so, but find people in your network who love the small project and how fast it is and how nice the finishes tend to be, because, it's a smaller unit. So people might splurge a little bit on the backsplash. And if you find the people in your network who love this stuff, and then just be able to refer people. Don't try to be the expert, because this law changes so quickly that it's very time consuming to know everything.
For sure. And now that you're back in California, I'm going to hit you up again to do another seminar for our local realtors, which was really, really amazing feedback on that. just what is it, a year and a half ago.
Fast, fast.
A year and a half ago, you did a seminar. There had a bunch of realtors in the room, and we just basically we give an overview and then open forum, ask a bunch of questions. And I think that knowledge is really important. And if you are a real estate professional kind of anywhere in California, you can reach out to Ryan through his website, How to ADU, and YouTube channel. You have a Facebook group.
Yeah, 80,000 people.
80,000 people in the Facebook group. I'm a member. I get all the updates with people asking questions. Sometimes I'm laughing at the questions.
It's wild.
It's wild. And so how else do people contact you? So again, if you're a professional and you're getting questions, like if you're a realtor or a lender or whatever, and you're getting questions about this, we don't know all the answers, but someone like Ryan does, and there's lots of resources. So where do people find you? What type of information can they provide? What type of, do they pay you? How does that work to get advice? How does it work?
As much as possible, point people to the free resources, right? Because if they watch the YouTube channel, they'll usually learn to self-serve on the information they need. If they really run into a particularly sticky problem from the rules perspective, sometimes they hire me hourly. But honestly, that's not the goal. I got lots of sponsors. So the people who watch the channel, if they're looking for a builder, they'll end up finding one through Realm. If they watch the channel and they're looking for finance, sometimes I point people to finance solutions. And so don't worry about it. Send people to the free resources. And if they keep running into challenges, then send people my way. The other thing that's probably worth just sending people directly an email to me, it's ryan@howtoadu.com. If you've got local electeds who want to think about their policy better, I can hook them up with the right people. But don't stress about that. Use the free resources. They're free because they're the most commonly asked questions. Right?
Yep. So check out the YouTube channel, and you really engage with your audience and stuff, right? So if you're curious about something and you're commenting on the Facebook group or whatever, then you're involved, and your moderators and stuff get really involved in stuff. So really great free resources, lots of knowledge out there. And there's I was watching some older videos. I'm like, oh, this is no longer relevant because there's a new thing that's passed. So really watch those latest videos. Make sure you're liking and subscribing so you get alerted to stuff, because you're posting stuff frequently about, hey, here's a thing that's changing. Here's some action that's going on. So people who are interested can get the latest, greatest information and not miss it.
That's it. And then every now and then I'll ask you for something. I'll say, hey, write an email to this politician and we might free up $50 million in funding.
You know what's crazy? Yeah, you know what's crazy about that is we have through some of the mortgage political action groups that we're involved with, we get requests like, hey, write an email, and they have a template, and you gotta put in your zip code and send it to everyone. I'm sure you could have the same thing.
That's how I set it up.
What's really interesting about that is the amount of personal replies you get. I got one from, I don't remember who it was, one of our state officials. And it was like, you could tell it was them or like a highly ranking advisor of theirs, whatever, like a staffer that got back. Cause it was not a canned email. It was like, hey, Dan, we really take these things seriously. Either that or their AI is really good. I'm not sure which one it is.
I promise you that was a real person on staff.
Like the staffers like really reading it, and they responded with like, appreciate what you do for our community and blah, 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 blah. And we care about the housing solutions. And it was something to do with the mortgage reform thing. And like the consumer experience is really important. So like, yeah, we're on it. This is something that we're going to be voting for. It's really cool.
It's amazing. And like I said, one email makes a huge difference. It's really crazy how politicians don't hear from normal people as much as they used to.
Right.
And there's all these special interest groups. Housing is one of the few places where really normal people somehow break through and share their stories. And I get to sit in meetings with our state elected officials, our local elected officials, now sometimes national stuff. And it's really impressive because they're not used to it anymore.
So next time you feel the urge that you want to like get in the comments and like mash out one of those messages, take that energy and send an email to your local electeds. And that is more impactful than,
commenting on the
trolls in the local paper in the Argus Courier website or Press Democrat or whatever you're reading, the Marin IJ. Okay, so I'll leave all the show notes and your contact information in there. And I'm really grateful to get back in the room with you, and welcome back to California after your stint away.
I feel welcome. Thank
Ryan,
you for
I really
me.
appreciate you and your expertise and for sharing it with the audience. And thank you for being here on By the Bay, and we'll see you sometime soon. Cool.
Stay up to date with Bay Area real estate. Hit subscribe now if you haven't already. Did you enjoy this episode? We love reviews in the Apple Podcasts app. We'll read yours on the show. This is By the Bay.
London Ear Media.